She never imagined the past she tried to outrun would come back as a secret worth billions. Most of her life, she had to bear her father's rejection, told that she wasn't good enough, pretty enough, and acceptable enough for a man who merely walked away and didn't look back. Months after his death, however, the truth began to unravel. One entangled in wealth and shame, shaped by the color of her skin and size of body. What she found out didn't rewrite her childhood alone. It revealed a deeper injustice, and the question that remained was simple. Why did he hide everything from her? She grew up believing her life was already written for her: small apartment, modest routines, and a world that treated her like she took up too much space. For years, she had worked quietly at a local community center, helping kids with homework, keeping her head low, and pretending the whispers about her size and her skin didn't sting as much as they did. She learned early that people judged her before they even knew her name. But even with all of that, she tried to move forward, telling herself she didn't need anyone, especially not the father who'd abandoned her without a trace. All she knew about him were the fragments her mother left behind. The man who walked out the moment she was born, claiming she was a burden, a mistake he didn't want to carry. She never heard a word of apology from him, nor did she ever see his face again, nor even get a birthday card. To her, he was a ghost, one she had no urge to chase. But everything changed the day she received a letter with his last name printed on the envelope. At first, she thought it was a mistake. She didn't know he had died, and she certainly didn't know he had lived a life so massive, so unreachable, it made her own feel microscopic. The letter didn't say much, just an invitation to a reading of his will. What she didn't realize then was that this wasn't just a formality. This was the beginning of a truth that would shatter everything she thought she knew about him. And about herself. She entered the law office expecting nothing, possibly a small apology, some closure, or a confirmation that he had lived the selfish life she had always imagined. But the second she stepped inside, she felt it in the room. The receptionist's eyes dragged over her body with thinly veiled judgment. Two men in expensive suits whispered to one another, staring at her as though she'd wandered into a place where she didn't belong. It wasn't the first time she felt that way. Their reactions, though, held something a little more pointed, an unspoken question of why someone like her was there at all. When the executor entered, he barely acknowledged her. Instead, he spoke in a tone she'd heard 1,000 times, slow, skeptical, and patronizing. He explained that her father had been a respected billionaire with assets spanning continents, private estates, companies, trusts, and generational wealth so vast it didn't feel real. And as he spoke, she watched the room shift again. The whispers grew heavier, the looks grew colder. The air itself seemed to tighten. Because she didn't fit the picture of what they thought a billionaire's daughter should be. Not black, not plus-sized, not someone who came in by bus in scuffed shoes and a bag she had owned since forever. She was a mistake in the narrative, an interloper in a world that didn't want her. The executor read on, and the tension cracked open. Her father hadn't mentioned her anywhere at the beginning. No acknowledgement, no message, no mention of her name. She listened silently, trying to swallow the sting of knowing he'd left behind vast treasures to distant business partners, charities he never visited, and even a dog he barely owned. Her name appeared toward the end, buried between clauses and conditions that felt intentionally convoluted. Not money, not at first. What he had left behind was a sealed envelope and a message saying, "Whatever she receives shall depend on proof." Of what, nobody knew. But the room reacted instantaneously. One of the well-off guests laughed boisterously, mumbling something like scams and people always trying to get a piece. Another whispered that she was probably lying about being his daughter in the first place. It was a familiar sting, the kind she'd grown used to since childhood. People assuming she didn't belong, couldn't be connected to anything valuable, simply because her body and her skin didn't fit their expectations. But hearing it here, surrounded by her father's world, carried a new kind of pain, a deeper one. She opened the envelope with shaking hands. Inside was a single photograph. Her father holding her as a newborn. His eyes weren't cold. They weren't distant. He looked proud. And behind the picture was an address, handwritten, with a simple instruction. Visit this place. The truth is there. The room fell silent as she stared at the address. Some scoffed. Some smirked. But none of them knew what the photograph meant to her. That for the first time she had proof she wasn't the burden he had claimed. She had proof he had loved her once, before something made him walk away. And now she needed to know what that something was. Because hidden in that address, in a place she had never been, was the truth that would expose everything he spent a lifetime trying to bury. And she had no idea just how dangerous that truth would be. The address led her to a gated estate at the city's edge, far from the world she knew. The security guard at the entrance looked her up and down, even before checking the name that she gave. His disbelief was immediate, laced with the same suspicion she had felt in that conference room. But when he finally confirmed she was on the list, something in his eyes shifted. Not respect, not kindness, more like shock that someone who looked like her could be connected to someone so powerful. Inside, the truth unraveled piece by piece. The estate wasn't just costly. It stood as a testament to the life her father had built without her. Photos lined the hallways, each one reminding her of all that she'd been excluded from. Business galas and luxury trips, charity events where he stood beside the families he financially supported. Families that weren't hers. Families that looked nothing like her. Families he was proud to stand beside. But it was the final room that delivered the blow she never expected. On the wall were documents. Legal papers, transcripts, letters, outlining why he'd left. Not because of her size, not because he felt unprepared, but because his wealthy white family refused to accept a black daughter. They had threatened to cut him off, destroy his reputation, and dismantle the empire he was creating. And he chose them. He chose money, status, whiteness. He chose everything but her. At the center of the room was a video recording labeled with her name. With trembling hands, she pressed play. On that screen was her father, older, weaker, eyes filled with the weight of a man who knew he'd run out of time to fix what he broke. He said it all. The racism, the cowardice, the fortune built on silence. He said he regretted everything. Regret didn't erase the years she spent believing she was unworthy, unwanted, unloved. The video ended with a line that cut deeper than any insult she'd ever heard. If you're watching this, then the truth finally caught up with me. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. Her father's empire had been built on the sacrifice of her existence. And now she had to decide what to do with the truth that could burn it to the ground. She left the estate carrying more than documents, more than evidence. She carried the weight of a truth that long before she knew of its existence had molded her life. All her life, she would blame herself for her father's absence because she wasn't enough. But now she understood that the wound ran deeper than abandonment. It was a wound carved by a world where power mattered more than people, where a black daughter was seen as a threat to a white legacy, and where silence was easier than courage. Lawyers called in the days that followed. Reporters searched for details, and her father's associates scrambled to protect their pristine image. Some urged her to stay quiet, cautioning her that the truth would ruin his reputation, and theirs. But for the first time in her life, she refused to shrink herself to make others comfortable. She chose to speak, not for revenge, but for the little girl she once was, the child who spent years believing she had been born unworthy. But when she finally came forward, the world predictably responded with both skepticism and indignation, with silence from those people who benefited most from keeping her story buried. Still, her voice carried further than they ever anticipated. Her story put a mirror up to a still too often hypocritical society, forcing people to continue to choose between acceptance and identity, family and fairness, truth and the comfort of denial. She didn't get that fairy tale ending people imagine when money is involved. What she got was clarity, freedom, and the power to reshape the narrative that once defined her. Because at the very core, this wasn't just a story about a hidden fortune. This was a story about the cost of racism, about the lives it distorts and the families it tears apart long before the world ever notices. And it leaves us with one question. How many other stories like hers are not known because nobody dared to dig deeper?